Did you know that Africa is home to nearly two-thirds of all people living with HIV/AIDS globally? So naturally, when Trump decided to cut down HIV funding through US aid, you better trust that Africa was the continent that was most affected. And so in this video, I am going to be talking about why Africa relies very heavily on international aid. So that's the first thing we'll be talking about today. And then after that, we're going to be talking about why I think Africa is leading in terms of HIV/AIDS prevalence. It is no doubt that when people hear the word Africa, they typically associate it with poverty, they associate it with a lot of other things. But one of the things that people associate Africa with the most is diseases. And so we're going to be talking about why a disease like HIV/AIDS is just spreading like wildfire in the continent. So if that is something that sounds interesting to you, stick along and subscribe, comment, share, all of that stuff. I hope you'll enjoy the video. So one of my biggest concerns with African politics and African governments is that there's a very, very heavy reliance on international aid. And I've always wondered, why is it that we are almost fully reliant on other people? Because, for example, when Trump came into power, and one of the things that his government is very focused on is cutting international funding. And I think I was reading somewhere that they were able to save $60 billion just by cutting funding within US aid. And so to me, it was just like, okay, this is a 90-day pause that he began for US aid. What if this goes on forever? What if this is something that he decides is just going to be the thing, that they're going to reduce funding and that's it? Because there are some countries in Africa, a country like Zimbabwe, for example, that relies on US aid for 80% of its budget when it comes to HIV programs. And the question is, think about this like on the individual level. If you were somebody who 80% of your life's budget is reliant on somebody else, the moment that person dies, you're essentially also dead. Because 20%, what's 20% gonna do? What's 20% gonna do? So to me, the fact that two-thirds of the entire world, two-thirds of people who live with HIV/AIDS in the world live in Africa. And Africa is the continent that is also struggling to create proper health budgets. To me, that's just like, oh my God, are we ever going to make it out of this? Because HIV is a real disease. And I know there's a lot of stigma about it around it as well. But my concern today is that these are real people. And some of them, yeah, sure, it is a sexually transmitted disease. And you could argue that it was due to reckless sexual behavior. But some people were born with HIV/AIDS. You don't get to decide that. And the question is, why? What can we do as a continent to ensure that, first of all, there is limited spread of HIV/AIDS? Because Africa is not the continent that leads, I would say, in, reckless sexual behavior. I would argue other continents are leading in that, especially because in my limited understanding of most African cultures, I would argue we lean very heavily on conservativeness, and I would argue that realistically speaking, we should not be leading when it comes to HIV/AIDS. So the question is, why is it that we're leading? Number one, obviously, I would say it's poverty. With poverty, I know poverty gets blamed for a lot of things, but with poverty, I think the issue is that if somebody is poor, they're very, very likely to engage in activities like transactional sex, for example, to become a sex worker. And I thought about this and I was like, when you work with children like I have, when you ask a kid, what do you want to do when you grow up? You will never hear a child say, oh, I want to be a sex worker when I grow up. They will never say that because that is not a desire that people have. So usually it's poverty that leads people into transactional sex behavior. And as a woman, especially when you're involving yourself in transactional sex behavior, you do not have a lot of freedom to say no to things, and that could also lead to unsafe sex, and that could eventually lead to HIV/AIDS and also transmission of other sexual diseases. So I think that is one of the reasons that Africa is leading in this, is because a lot of women in Africa are poor. Like, the continent is poor, yes, but women also carry the burden of poverty in the continent. And so it's not a surprising thing to me that when you look at the statistics as well, it is adolescent girls and young women who are leading in HIV/AIDS. So I was looking at this a couple of days ago. Let me just pull up my notes before I lie to you all. Adolescent girls and young women are particularly vulnerable. So in South Africa, for example, adolescent girls aged between 15 to 19 have a 5.8 prevalence rate. So that's roughly 6% compared to 4.7% for boys. So it's a 1% difference, which seems small, but I think it's significant to consider that why are girls, teenage girls, by the way, why are they having HIV/AIDS transmitted to them more quickly? While you could almost argue that boys have more sex than girls, even especially at an adolescent age. So that is very, very concerning. Beyond just women, there is a lot of talk about men who have sex with men, so basically homosexual men. I don't know if that's offensive or not, but there was even a time, I think a lot of people know about this, that there was even a time when people would say that HIV/AIDS was spreading the quickest among homosexual men because they weren't practicing safe sex. But I think this has something to do as well with the way sex education is treated in the continent. It's just that I feel like we don't talk about sex education in the continent, at least in Tanzania. I'm just going to throw Tanzania under the bus because when I was in school, my school did have sex education, but it wasn't part of the syllabus, like the official National Examination Council of Tanzania syllabus. It wasn't. That's just something that my school did, and part of the reason they did it is because it's a Christian school. So they were like, you know what, we're gonna, I don't know, help these kids so they don't get into too much trouble. Or if they do, they know what to do. But officially in the Tanzanian syllabus, there isn't such a thing as sex education. Actually, speaking of which, I could just look this up. How many countries in Africa have sex ed? Because I don't even think that from the conversations that I've had with my friends, I don't even think that this is something that we've spoken about in the sense that if whether or not their countries do have sex aid. So my response here is saying that approximately in the world itself, only 132 out of 155 countries have policies that support sexuality education. So let's see, what about Africa? Because I highly doubt if Tanzania is on this list, then I would just not trust their statistics or data because what I got was not quote-unquote sex ed. I still think that there should be dedicated classes that teach people the consequences of having unsafe sex, just beyond, oh, you're going to get pregnant or you're going to become a father before you're ready. So, I knew it. It says approximately 46 African countries have adopted policies and commitments. There we go, commitments to implement comprehensive sex ed. Notably, 21 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa and 25 in West and Central Africa have endorsed regional commitments. So these are just commitments, but are they practicing it? Because if we were actually actively teaching children, especially young kids, because they're the ones who are rowdy, I guess. If we are actively teaching sex ed, I don't think we would be seeing that the number of HIV patients is still growing in the continent. So that's part of the reason. But another reason that I think this is, I think we just don't have these conversations enough. I feel like compared to other countries, if there was a disease that was rising up, I feel like they would have already just like found it at the roots and cut it from there. But as a continent, I just feel like I don't see that movement or that focus on our own health. And I think that brings me to the main conversation here is that we're very reliant on international aid to the extent that we're not actively working on solving our own problems because we know that somebody else will try and solve it for us, that some kid from America who wants some credit for volunteering will want to come do something for us. So why should we do it? Why should we set a good health budget to fight HIV/AIDS while the US can come fund us through USAID, while the US can come give us some money through WHO, while some country that wants to look good and virtue signal wants to give us their money? Why should we care about setting aside enough money? So to me, it's just like, the reason I'm complaining about this, because this is very much me complaining, is that when USAID cut their funding, a lot of things happen in the continent in a very, very terrible butterfly effect. And it was foreseen by a lot of people. And people were complaining, they're like, oh my God, people are going to lose jobs, which is so funny to me that was one of the main concerns, because somebody losing their job is the last thing on my mind when it comes to cutting funding. There are real people with real lives who rely on real medication for them to live. And some of these people naturally died after USAID funding was cut. And to me, it's just like, if African countries were taking hold of their budgets and their funding to their people, once USAID funding was cut off, it would just be like, oh, oopsie, like that was just a supplement. That was just something that was complementing the efforts that we were already putting in as countries. But once that was off, countries like Zimbabwe, countries like South Africa suffered. There were research trials that were in progress that were stopped. There were clinics that were closed. Real people had their lives affected. There are people who no longer have access to this medication, or if they do, their programs have changed, so they don't have the same access or the same affordability, the same access to these medications. And this is just for one disease. This is just HIV/AIDS. Okay, can you imagine all the other diseases that the funding has been affected by Trump's policies? Which, by the way, I'm not going to talk about American politics because this is not about American politics. But what bothers me is that that is something that he's doing for his country. It's none of our business. That is the money that comes from US taxpayers. So US taxpayers are giving their money to their government, and then the government is like, oh, we're going to give it to other people. I would be offended as an American as well, because for African people to be taken care of, it has to be with African money. And we have no excuse as African countries to be like, oh, we don't have the money. Where did the money go? Where did the money go that you take from all the minerals? Where did the money go that you take from all the electricity that you're selling from other countries? I know countries like, countries like Tanzania, for example, there was a time I think we were selling electricity to Uganda. Where's the money that you made from that? Where's the money that you got from taxing your people? Where's the money that you get from all the exports, from agricultural products? Where's the money from all the other economic activities going on in the country, from fishing? Where is that money? Because we don't see it in infrastructure, we don't see it in education, we don't see it in HIV funding or even disease research funding. The fact that the leading institutions when it comes to researching diseases, none of them is in Africa. None of them, not even one. The leading researchers in HIV, they're not in Africa, they're not Africans. Okay, my query is, this is a thing that is obviously affecting us the most. Two-thirds of the world's HIV population lives in Africa. 2/3. Can you imagine if it was for any other statistic? Like, imagine if I can't even think of an example, because it's 2/3. That is 1, 2, 3, and 2 of them are in Africa, and we are the ones who carry the burden of HIV, but we're the ones who are giving the least when it comes to research funding. We're the ones who are begging the most when it comes to taking care of our own people. And this is what the message of this channel keeps coming back to. It's that we're not taking care of our people. Who's going to? Because these are children of the continent. Like, these are the children of Africa, and nobody is taking care of them because USAID is now gone. I mean, I know it's a 90-day pause whatsoever, but what if Americans decide, actually, we don't want to give you our money. We're not entitled to that money. And we're also not entitled to Europe's money. We're not entitled to, South America's money, to Asia's money. The only money that Africans are entitled to is Africa's money. But Africa's money is being used by politicians to fund their own pockets. Because why is it that people are still dying of HIV in the continent? Well, all these politicians, every time they're sick, they go abroad to get treated. Our people cannot afford to go abroad to get themselves treated. And HIV is a real disease. It has real consequences. Sure, we have ARVs now. Sure, we have all these fancy schmancy drugs that the people have invented. Sure, a mother can have HIV and then give birth to a child without it. But people with HIV, they suffer real consequences. Their lifespan is affected in some sense. And that's just like the biological side. We're not even going to talk about the social stigma that comes with that. And if you can prevent more people from having a disease that has such negative stigma, a disease that has such negative biological effects, why wouldn't you do it? So I'm very frustrated. I'm very infuriated, by the way, because I keep saying this. There's a video I spoke about this as well. Because when I was a kid, I used to be like, oh my god, when I grow up, by the time I grow up, I think HIV will be gone. I genuinely thought that, because when I was learning in school, I was like, oh my god, what a disease. And that's not just, it's just one of them. There are also other sexually transmitted diseases that I haven't spoken about in this video. So I'm very, very, very frustrated, because this is just an example that relying on other people is a terrible idea. Relying on international aid is a terrible idea, because there are countries in Africa who still rely on international aid when it comes to food. Like, you can't grow your own food, as if you don't have land. There are countries in Africa that still rely on other countries for like manufacturing. I'm not going to name what country this is, but it's a statistic that I just came across. There's a certain country in Africa. I'm so tempted to say it, but I think people will get it once I say what product this is. But there's a country in Africa that imports eggs. Oh my gosh. You're importing eggs. There's a country in Africa that is importing sugar. Sugar. And there is plenty of land. I have been around. I haven't been to every single country in the continent, but I've been around. There is so much land that is just chilling. And I'm like, you can't go ahead and build something for yourselves. Do you know how embarrassing it is when I was scrolling through Instagram when USAID funding was cut, and the only thing was Africans complaining like, oh my god, they've cut off funding. Your funding? Your funding? Like, Americans are paying taxes so that you and your government leaders can just chill and wait for their money? No. I am very empathetic towards people who are living with HIV in the continent, because they have been affected from this. They're relying on their government. Some of these people are working. Some of these people are paying taxes to the government, but they're not seeing any of that. So I'm very, very frustrated. But with that, I want to give a shout out to Ethiopia, just because I was reading one of like what have African countries done now that USAID funding is cut, and I found that Ethiopia introduced a payroll tax as a part to like fill the financial gap that is caused by USAID funding going away. So I just want to give it a shout out to Ethiopia. It is, in reality though, it is one of those countries that is doing really, really well. So just a shout out as we end the video. And that's it for today. I think I've just yapped and complained and gone off the rails, but I'm so appreciative if you've watched this far, and I'll see you in the next video because I'm too angry. But thank you for watching, and you'll see me in the next video.